We need to come together this December and drink as much Fanta as we can, because if Mthuli Ncube has his way, Fanta is not going to be Fanta come January. Mthuli wants to start charging a new tax on the sugar in your fizzy drinks. Apparently, this will discourage the consumption of high sugar content. Each drink will now come with a tax of 2 cents per gram of sugar. The money will be used for therapy and procurement of cancer equipment and diagnosis.
Okay, thank you. So as far as I'm concerned, this is not a budget. This is a weapon of mass destruction against the poor people.
Is to try and see how do we protect that goose that laid the golden egg. That is the main point, and that is the policy of taxation that I came up with. I talked about, please do not raise tax rates to the point where it becomes an inducement for you to evade taxes. That is, you're killing the goose that laid the golden egg unless you want to say bye-bye to the golden egg. When you are in such a dire situation, when poverty is biting and cost of living is rising, that is not the time to increase taxes or retarget taxes. That is the time to look at areas where you can provide interventions.
When we talk about economies, when we talk about politics and governing of a country, policies are very important, especially policies that deal with ensuring that those who are underprivileged in our societies are given a fair opportunity to also step up and live better lives. Now, for this to happen, governments need to be put in check. They need to be asked questions consistently by the citizens, and this is mostly done through organized civic action by NGOs and civic society. Now, on this, the situation right now with me, your host as usual, Dara B, we get into those details. We ask the question, so what? What is it in it for you? So what? So what if the government is not asked the question? What happens to you? We ask the question so you know why it matters to you. Now join me after this break as we discuss people, power, and politics. Welcome back to This The Situation right now with me, your host as usual, Dara B. Now we're talking about the rich and the rich who continue taking and also talking about tax. You know, the budget that was announced by Professor Mthuli Ncube just last year, many economists were saying that it is affecting the poor mostly. It is overtax people already. And as we speak in studio to be able to discuss these things and understand some of these things around tax, around how to create wealth for people, and around how to improve the lives of those underprivileged, I have the director of ZIMCODD, John Maketo, who's going to be talking to us about direction. Especially, I'll start with him on the tax level. Then we can move on to other things. I just want to welcome you and thank you for joining us in this 2025.
Thank you so much, Dara. Thank you for having me in the studio.
Beautiful. Now let's talk about this. I understand, and some reading. You as ZIMCODD are looking into changing tax structures so that the poor can benefit more. Let us have this conversation.
Sure. Thank you so much. So we are advocating for fairer taxes, tax justice, advocating for taxation regimes that recognize people's levels of income, and in that we are particularly advocating that the rich pay their fair taxes. We are speaking against taxes that are blind to the fact that not everyone is earning at the same level. So application of taxes that are not alive to people's levels of different levels of income is what we are speaking against as ZIMCODD. So basically in tax justice we are also advocating for distribution of taxes and redistribution of taxes by the government to ensure that the lives of the poor are made better, other than protecting the rich by way of taxation.
But someone would argue that the rich are the ones who sit on the table of power. How do you think it's possible for you to convince the rich to tax themselves more and tax the poor less?
Precisely, that is the structure that we particularly want to change. Is the governance structure that we want to change. We want to believe that when everybody pays taxes, they have a voice to how revenues are actually redistributed and are utilized within an economy. And that idea of the rich sitting themselves on a table where the poor are excluded is particularly, resembled by the World Economic Forum in Davos, which is happening in Davos. I think the whole of next week, the world leaders, the richest in the world, the 1% of the world, is gathering in Davos, making decisions about the welfare of the 99% of the world. So 1% of the world controls wealth of the whole world, and we are saying that 99% of the poor have a say in how their future looks like. We are all paying taxes, so that dollar which I pay, contributing to the national or global revenue, gives me a say in how resources are actually distributed across the economy. So that idea where we say, I get a seat on the table because I have so much, should be done away with. Fair governance allows for equality in all opportunities.
But is that not in your view a contradiction? Because you're saying that those who are rich should pay more, those who are poor should pay less. So if I'm rich, I say you're asking me to pay more, that's fine, I want to pay more, but I want to have more say because I'm paying more than you. So that inequality and that disequilibrium continues.
Precisely. Well, the correction is only that we're not saying that the poor pay less. We're saying that the poor pay their own fair share of taxes. So if I'm paying what is commensurate to what I earn, it's not paying less. If I'm paying 50% of my $50 income, I've paid a lot. But we want that proportion to go right up to the end of the ladder. The person who is earning $1 million must also be paying 50% as much as I'm paying 50%. But we have structures of tax regimes that protect the rich. So for example, just to localize this conversation, the 2% tax in Zimbabwe, it puts a cap where you get to a point where you cannot pay beyond that. That's protecting the rich. But there is no bottom minimum.
Actually, there is a bottom minimum. I think when it was introduced, it was 10,000. People complained that it was just too little, and they increased it a bit. And now with the change of the currency, I'm not very sure what's the bottom cap, but there is a bottom cap, is it not?
The bottom cap that I refer to is the bottom cap to say, if you are transacting, you want to send some money to your mother, your grandmother in the rural area, so it must recognize the purpose, it must recognize the recipient. For example, welfare of child-headed households. It's towards tuition fees payment, remittance to rural households. That's the bottom minimum I'm talking about. It must recognize purpose. It must recognize the beneficiary even by age. If you are sending money to a pensioner, there must be some exemption around that. That's the bottom minimum I'm talking about, not just in figures.
Okay. But how do we get there to say this? We are exempting other people from tax because they are on the bottom minimum. Yet those that we are exempting are the ones who benefit more from government's social service delivery than the rich.
Good. Very good point. So the social services are there primarily because it's to cushion people who are recognized to be more vulnerable. So that's primarily the reason why we are saying you cannot provide for them in one hand and take away from them with the other hand. So if you recognize that this category is vulnerable, it must be cushioned and protected from all ends and from all corners. We are also saying that when the rich pay their own fair share of taxes and the resources are directed towards the protection of the most vulnerable in society, it brings an equilibrium within the society. I want to point out here that it's not just a dichotomous kind of conversation, we're saying rich and poor, but the kind of rich that we also have today that have mechanisms and means to avoid paying taxes. People that have power and wealth to smuggle their goods into the country or out of the country and avoid paying their fair share of taxes, that we can protect them. People that have power and means, to avoid being stopped and searched by police or by border authorities. People whose bags are not searched at the airport because of power, because of positions of authority, and yet they are also in business and they are earning. This is the conversation that we want to have, to say, let the rich pay their own fair share of taxes. If I am bringing in and importing luxury goods every month, every now and again, and I'm able to, flash that kind of wealth on social media, for example, it should be a source of concern for everyone, including the government, to say, what sort of tax remittances are you bringing in? Is it commensurate to your earnings? There should be explain your source of wealth kind of direction, and also declaring pay what you're earning. That's the conversation.
I think we can feel attacked by this last statement that you made.
No names. No names.
But I want us to look at the tax regime in Zimbabwe and say, do you find it as a fair tax regime? Because government is looking to fund health services, is looking to build roads and stuff like that. Do you find it as a fair tax regime from your studies? Because I'm sure for you to come up with this concept, you had some study around the tax regime in Zimbabwe.
Thank you so much. The government has done a lot around working on the tax regime in Zimbabwe. There are good progressive taxes that have been introduced in the recent past years that ensure that it improves and increases domestic resource mobilization. I could name a few, but generally we have moved miles in a positive direction. But there also remains, I think, room for improvement. For example, I want to talk about the wealth tax introduced in the 2024 national budget. The implementation is another thing, but the direction itself, that people with properties that to a certain level, those properties are then taxed. That's the kind of action or tax regimes that resembles taxing the rich. And it recognizes that there is a primary residence which is then exempted from the taxation, but every secondary, which is above a certain threshold, is then what? Is then taxed. And you don't go and tax, the primary residence, which is maybe a value of 10, 15, 20,000. So that kind of direction is what mirrors the taxing the rich element, which we are talking about in terms of addressing existing inequalities. The second layer is also around improvement in terms of ring-fencing resources that are generated from those kind of taxes that have been generated. Another good example of taxations that have been introduced, for example, tax on the sugar, it's in the right direction, but again,
companies are crying rivers over those taxes, and they're saying that the taxes are choking their business, and they are being forced to close. And when a big organization closes, it hits the poor hardest. So how do we balance that?
No. We don't want companies to be closing. But we cannot also exempt them from paying their fair share of taxations. They have to be paying and their fair share of taxes. What we need to be talking about as well in terms of companies paying their taxes and ring-fencing those resources, the royalties from those companies, the tax holidays provided to certain companies, those must actually be reviewed to ensure that they progressively pay their taxes. Companies are closing for different reasons, and it's not a discussion for today, but around contributing to the national fiscus. We cannot be apologetic about that. That's how it's structured. Individuals, the poorest of the poor in society, must be cushioned towards an equitable society.
Yeah. Let's talk about Davos. The 1% that sits at Davos are very instrumental in funding health needs for the poor, even in funding civic society. Now, do you think that it is the right thing to say that this 1% has no voice or must not be able to sit, excluding the have-nots, when they have shared their money? Like, let's talk about Bill Gates, for example, the Melinda Gates Foundation, the work that it has done for the poor, the money that they've poured in fighting malaria. I mean, don't they have not earned their right to talk and even to avoid tax, because they are putting money directly to social services and at times avoiding corruption?
Thank you for that question. I have a sense you actually don't believe what you are saying, but forgive me. We cannot pay our way up to enjoy civic rights. We cannot do that. We are talking about respect of fundamental rights, enjoyment of fundamental rights, poor or rich. Everybody has got that right. You have a right to shelter, right to health, right to food, right to I don't have to pay my way out. I don't have to pay my way out to be able to get the right to vote. So we are also saying, this is the bigger picture of the conversation. As world, the world elite gathered in Davos, in lavish, expensive hotels. What is happening down? You want to picture the life of the poorest of the poor in Epworth, in Bari, in Hope House, in Tare, in Binga, in Gokwe. Why is it that year after year the national fiscus has to contribute towards delegates traveling to Davos? Thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars are spent towards that. Funds that can be redirected towards social protection of the poor. Secondly, on a north-south dichotomy, we also believe that why is it centralized in Davos? We want to believe that in a way it's centralization of revenue generation in the north over the south. I would want to enjoy one day the World Economic Forum hosted in Harare, in Lusaka, and let the world elite come and spend their monies in our economies. I'm sure it would do a great deal if millions are going to be left in Harare. But it's always Davos because of the luxurious nature of that. You can say that they've earned it and it's their money, but it's being spent at the expense of the poor. when government leaders travel to Davos, they don't use personal monies. You talk about Bill and Melinda Gates. Well, they're using their foundation monies, but what about our world leaders? Our presidents, our ministers?
Don't they go there to clinch important deals that then come and transform the lives of people?
We're yet to point any deals that have actually materialized, that have changed the lives of the poor from Davos. If there is any example, we are yet to see it. On the second level, it's the backdrop of Davos. Just it does not have the reality of the people. You cannot discuss about us without us. You have said that they've ended, but you cannot decide for us without us. There are no consultations. There are no consultations of what is it really that you need to do for the poor. And it becomes a very elite conversation, divorced from the realities of people on the ground. That is why you see that measures that have long been devised to counter climate change in developing countries, some have failed and they are not working. Measures to counter poverty have not worked.
Who do we blame for this? I mean, who should we put the blame on so that these people can begin to change this kind of thinking in the way that you're talking about?
We want to blame the process. We want to blame the ideology that the rich have the best ideas. They know the needs of everybody. We want to change the ideology that only a handful of people have the solutions to the problems of the world, to the problems of the 99% of the world, at whatever level, national level, regional level, and global level.
This ideology is not forced on people. It's not forced on your leaders. Is it?
It is imposed. It is imposed. That's the nature. Capitalism, neoliberalism, colonialism are the agents of this ideology.
No one says to your president you should leave and go to Davos. If Zimbabwe doesn't go to Davos, what happens to it?
You're isolated from the rest of the globe. Austerity. And with austerity comes these issues that affect the poor the most. Austerity measures which comes with mechanisms that are dictated by international institutions, World Economic Forum platforms, and they are divorced from the realities that people in developing countries are facing. They are then come tell you must tighten your belt. They'll come and tell you retrench. They are talking about the theme for Davos this year is about embracing the world of intelligence, right? And what does that do to us? The COP 2024 says that it talks about just energy transition, but just in whose eyes and in whose sight? We know the historical background that the North developed from exploitation of resources in the South. They are at another level where they can afford to fund the transition, but we are not yet ready. How do we? So I'm simply saying that a table of the elites without the most affected, the ideas of the most affected, cannot come up with sustainable solutions for the rest of the world.
If I was to argue with you now and say we suffer less from those things that you're talking about, we suffer more from greed, from corruption, especially from the top echelons of leadership that run countries, especially in Africa. What would be your pushback?
The pushback is simple. The greed, the corruption is not isolated. It's not isolated. The corruption and the greed from Africa has got takers. They are takers. These people have got places to go and offload their monies. They have created safe havens for the loot that comes from Africa. And the safe havens are protected territories which you cannot go and investigate to say we are following up for our resources. These are the challenges. So for every problem associated with corruption and greed, you find that there's the demand and supply side of it. if the grid is localized, I feel it's manageable. However, that does not exonerate the problems of corruption, misgovernance locally in our national settings, in our regional settings, continental settings. But I'm saying that there is a fair share of blame to the takers of the loot that is looted from our countries. Who is dealing with Eastern, Western companies that are exploiting our resources? Who is doing that? And the people that are building properties in Asia, in Europe, and so forth, it's coming from Africa. So I'm simply saying that the blame is a shared blame. The corruption, the greed. I know this is not a popular view, but I also want to believe that African leaders have had good mentors in how to do corruption, and that they've had takers. They are corruption entrepreneurs. They are crisis entrepreneurs. We have invested a lot in Africa for the development of their own home countries, and this is what we are seeing right at the surface.
So shouldn't the blame start and end with our leaders? Because when we elect them to be inward-looking, to improve our countries. Yet you are saying that they are supplying a market with our resources.
It should, at the national level, we should call our leaders to account. This is also why we're extending the question to say we should call our government to account to say, you are spending $500,000 to go to Davos for a week, and we cannot see tangible results thereafter, year in, year out. We should call them to order on that. They should be accountable. There should be an introspection to say, what is this achieving for us? These forums. You talked about the foundations and the rich also funding our health sector, our food security sector. Fair. Philanthropies, we've heard of. But primarily, the responsibility is on our governments to fund and support our health sector. There is no reason why a resource-rich country like Zimbabwe should not be self-sufficient in those areas. They are coming in because there is a gap, there is insufficient. What has happened to our resources, our platinums, our diamonds, and so forth? And we cannot celebrate that our health sector is supported by international foundations and other philanthropies when we should be self-sufficient. When they decide that they are pulling out, we have to beg. When they decide that they are cutting funding, we have to beg. And that is not the life that we're all designed for in an equal world.
ZIMCODD once ran a campaign, How Far? And one of the things that you were challenging at that particular time was issues around corruption and leadership and direction. But I sense that you have taken a different direction, because now you're saying it's not really just about corruption, it's a shared responsibility. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. It's a shared responsibility, Blessed, because there's more than what meets the eye. They are actors beyond what we see that perpetuate. So, for example, when we see corruption, when people in Zimbabwe say there's a lack of accountability in that area, and even when people of Zimbabwe vote and say this is our choice, and those you have actors outside of Zimbabwe that probably have more influence in determining the sustainability of a government in power through funding for it, through opening investment lines for it. Do you really feel that we have our solutions in our hands? Do you really feel that as much as voices can emerge in Zimbabwe, everything has to end and start? Because the centers of power are dotted around, not just locally, but also internationally. So we cannot ignore the geopolitics that we are dealing with. We cannot ignore the ideology element. We cannot ignore, talk about public debt, for example. We talk about responsible borrowing. We can hold our leaders, to borrow responsibly But we cannot also ignore the international actors in the value chain of debt.
But how are
we should be asking for responsible lending. As much as we say responsible borrowing, we must be saying responsible lending.
How do we like? I just want to us to look at this. How do we say that we are supposed to be in the hands of those people that you talk about, when, for instance, in Africa we have 45% of the world's critical minerals in Africa. 45%.
Yeah.
We have 60% of the world's free arable land. But when Ukraine goes to war, we are hungry. And all we do is stand on podiums and talk Pan-Africanism. When our rich people are there, they're busy donating cars to musicians and the like. When the rich people of other countries are there, they're busy investing, building universities, funding schools, funding research. We marry wives. We buy thousands of shoes, like Mary Antoinette. In this age, you go to schools in Zimbabwe, right? Alfred Bate School. You go to Prince Edward, there's an Alfred Bate Hall. You go to the University of Zimbabwe, the library was funded by the Alfred Bate Foundation. Where are our heroes? What are they doing with their vast resources? They're buying houses in Davos. Now, whose fault is that?
So, blessed, one thing to set straight here: there is no condonation on millionaires, billionaires in our national context. We cannot condone corruption at whatever level. We cannot condone that. We cannot condone misgovernance at whatever level. And Pan-Africanism is not an element that condones bad governance. It does not condone bad leadership and greed. It recognizes the reality of historical development in the geopolitics of the world. It recognizes the unfair distribution of resources between the North and the South. It recognizes exploitation of the South by the North. And it also recognizes the continuing relationship that feeds and nurtures corruption locally from exogenous actors outside of Africa, outside of Zimbabwe. They are actors we don't see. You have seen documentaries, is it the Al Jazeera documentary, true or not, but they are clear actors dotted across the globe who are takers of the loot from Africa. And our leaders are willingly giving. Willingly giving, true. And they must be called to account.
Why would we want to blame those who are furthering their interests? Because when they take, they're developing their nation. And it is, when you are elected as a leader, it is your responsibility to further the interests of your nation. Why should we blame the guy in Dubai who's getting gold so that they change the welfare of the poor in their country? And then
we should not blame that guy. We should blame the actor. This is why I say we are not condoning corruption at every level. This is why we say we must civic action, the red line to billionaires, to millionaires, to mbingas, across every level, from national, regional, globally, that red line. This is why we are saying we must call to order lavish spending that ignores existing reality of poverty, existing reality of children that are dropping out of school, children that cannot afford tuition fees as little as $10, $5 in rural areas, but you have the largest number of school dropouts in those rural areas. And how much are we spending in Davos? How much are we spending in other lavish lifestyles? This is the clarion call for equity and equality in access to resources.
Now let's talk about the path. How do we get there? What is your plan of action for us to be able to arrive at that position that you're talking about? the taxation justice, where everyone pays a fair share in line with what they're getting towards provision.
Thank you. I think the starting point is the solutions lies with the people. What is it that the people need? What is it that is most critical to the people that you want to save? Like I said, you cannot assume ignorance, utter ignorance on the majority of the population because they are not educated, because they don't have money, because they don't have power. Consultation, good governance is grounded on consultation, on the voices of the people. You cannot assume ignorance, utter ignorance on the majority of the population because they are not educated, because they don't have money, because they don't have power.
The action plan, how do we get there? Like, talk to me, because ZIMCODD must have an action plan.
Sure.
For us to be able to achieve what you're talking about,
Sure.
the tax justice, to ensure that everyone is playing a fair part, and we also including the poor into making these decisions.
Yes. Thank you. So the starting point is recognizing the foundational principles of good governance and democracy, that power lies in the people. We cannot assume ignorance and lack of understanding of needs for the people that we serve. So there is a need to always go back to people, consulting people, understand their needs to serve them better. That should lead to the point of crafting policies that are pro-poor, policies that are pro-people, that recognize the nature of our society. I want to give a very good example on this point. That do you know that it should be easy for the minister when planning for the budget to know that in this particular ward we have how many schools, we have how many clinics, how many more do we need, how many people are traveling 5 kilometers to get to the nearest health center. These are realities that must inform policy planning. We must have this information on the dot in this day and age to know how many children are traveling more than 10 kilometers to go to school and channel our resources towards that. So I'm saying a basic understanding of our societal problems, and that understanding must be derived from consulting with the people. The second level is also an entrenched political will that that is vested on implementing policies that are pro-poor, that serve the people better. In Zimbabwe, we've got a well laid out development strategy, which we have a buy-in. We have also even contributed, been consulted, we've contributed to it, and one of the best in recent years. But again, the coordinated, centralized political will to implement to the latent spirit of the strategy, of the vision. Sometimes there is a lack of cohesion, there is discoordination, and sometimes inconsistency in policy implementation. And you talk about as well, another action step is to, there is no way we can be isolated from the rest of the region, rest of the globe. But we learn continuously from what other countries, what progressive tax measures, tax regimes have been implemented in other countries that we can also learn from. But again, I come back to say that they must be contextualized. They must be fit for purpose in our country. They must be relevant to us. We have a debt issue. You cannot separate issue of tax justice and public debt, because these are two pots that fund development financing. So we're talking about tax, this is about domestic resource mobilization. Debt, you're talking about external, resource mobilization and borrowing to fund your development needs. So in order to deal with the debt sustainability issues, we are not advocating for people not paying for taxes. We are saying fair taxation across the board. Fair taxation as a way to actually finance our development as a country. So those are some of the action steps. We must also have functional, strong institutions. functional and strong institutions, which is actually one of the sustainable development goals, to say we need to have strong institutions. These institutions are responsible for the implementation of policies that are enacted by government. We can talk about any kind of tax measures introduced, but if the institutions that have been put in place are not independent enough, you have your parliament, for example, you have got even different government departments and other commissions. If they're not independent, well-resourced, both the human resources, financial resources, the policy measures will never see the light of the day. So we need very strong institutions that are independent, that are oiled enough to do what they must do. This, we believe, should take us to a desired developmental goal.
Amazing, amazing. And we are running out of time, but I'll give you an opportunity to just talk briefly about ZIMCODD. What is ZIMCODD? What does it do? What does it stand for? And maybe people hear you just talking about taxes and think you're a junior Zimmer.
Far from that. Thank you so much. So ZIMCODD actually in full stands for Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development. The organization was founded in the year 2000. This year we are celebrating our silver jubilee. We're 25 years now. Founded on the principle of debt justice, a product of the Jubilee 2000 campaign, where simply we're advocating for debt cancellation, and a principle that we still believe in now, and debt relief for the simple reason that we cannot afford to pay. More debt simply means that more taxation on the poor, and it's a cycle. We stand for pro-poor policies. We stand for fair distribution of resources. We are a development partner centering around strengthening economic governance, economic development, policy analysis, and we are a coalition. We embrace a number of civil society organizations and NGOs that affiliate to our work, and we've engaged and partnered with different agents of governments in promoting our ideology as an organization. Thank you.
Amazing. Now, just before I let you go as well, I just, like I normally do, I'll give you an opportunity to say something, maybe that's from your heart or from your policy documents and stuff like this, under a minute. Look at people of Zimbabwe and talk to them. I'll give you an opportunity to speak from your heart.
This was not warned. Thank you. People of Zimbabwe, the world elites will be gathered in Davos, and for us it resembles of the lifestyle of the rich and famous. And at the same time, I know that we have many children that failed to go back into school this year simply because they cannot afford. One way or the other, we are dealing with many issues: poverty, hunger, and among other deprivations. It's a time that I implore all of you to actually take stock of the inequalities in your society and engage your leadership to speak, be it your legislator, your councillor, to speak about inequality issues that you're experiencing in your community or in your constituency, in their decision-making forums. I thank you.
Look, here the situation right now, and I, your host as usual, Dara B. Now, we pride ourselves in bringing new conversations that matter, conversation that will change our nation, that make things better for all of us. It's instructive that I'm having this conversation around tax and debt in Zimbabwe and in Africa, where we are a rich, very rich continent with vast mineral wealth, vast arable land. 60% of arable land is in Africa, the whole world. And Shingi Mtasa of the Msawara group, once said this, and I just want to quote. He says this: Africa has a mammoth task ahead. The task ahead is how do we look for partners who are serious and committed about participating in the long-term economic development of our continent, thereby resolving the stark imbalance that exists. We must be clear, Africa's problems are not the West, are not China, are not India or others, but ours and ours alone. It is our responsibility to sit down with our leaders, those that we elect, right? Those that we entrust with responsibility to govern us, to look at them and say, we want a better world. We want a country that treats all of us fairly, that gives us equal opportunities and equal access, so that our children, poor as we might be, will not remain the servants of the rich in perpetuity. That my child will have a legacy of serving those who are rich already, and their children will do the same. We want an equal opportunity, and ZIMCODD is advocating for that. Now this will always be the situation right now. And I, your host as usual, Darby. Until next time, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this content so that it gets wider reach. Until next time, thank you. Thank you very much, Jaleka.
Thank you very much.